Hello, everyone. Welcome again for yet another exciting session. It's week 3. How is everyone doing? Please let us know in the chats from where are you joining, and we'll get started in a couple of minutes.
India, the UK, the US, worldwide audience today, everybody.
Yeah,
Chicago, India,
Glasgow, cool.
Wow. Washington, D.C.
Oh,
Everyone's
that
from
must be
Glasgow.
early, really early, Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Singapore, really late.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Mars. Interesting.
Mars.
What's
Wow.
your Wi-Fi like up there?
Peru,
Wow.
wow.
Thank you all for joining us.
Awesome. Today, Ashish will not be able to join us. He has some personal thing to take care of. So a bit change in plan of what we'll be doing in the session today. We'll be starting off with the serverless track, the specialist track from James, and then we'll switch gears to the behavioral track. And we do have a special guest lined up for today, which we'll announce after James' session. But let's give another minute or so for people to join, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Paramanita. Yeah. Same role, just a slightly different word in front
Step
of it.
up, promotion.
Yeah, slightly step up.
James is being humble.
You want a party? I'm not sure what question. I've got enough party things behind me, so maybe we could have a party. I won't talk. We'll just have a drink instead. Awesome. So let's get into it then. So as Prasad said, we are unfortunately missing Ashish this week. So you're going to be listening to me for slightly longer than normal. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is I'll leave that up to you listening. So today we're going to talk about communication patterns and how to pass messages to each other to get work done in your systems. Let me just hide that thing. So last week we talked about event-driven architecture, and the week before that we talked about Lambda. So this is going to build on some of the things we've already learned, and we're actually going to get hands-on in the console today and actually have a look how to configure some of these things. So the reason communication patterns are important in serverless applications, because serverless applications are these small, loosely coupled pieces of code that do a single job. You know, if you're using a Lambda function, that Lambda function will have a single job or a single thing to do. But to build up any functionality in your applications, you're going to need to have Lambdas that work together and different parts of your system that are going to work together. So the integrations in your application between the different pieces become a vital part of your application. So understanding the different patterns of communication are really important when you start thinking about serverless applications. So when we talk about integrations, we talk about messages or message types. So last week we talked about event-driven architectures. Events are just a type of message. And there are 3 primary types of messages you might get in your application. There are command messages, there are document or data messages, and event-based messages or events. And we talked about them last week. So to go into each one in a little bit more detail, a command message is something where you expect a response. So if I'm talking to my dog, I will give my dog a command, and my dog may normally choose to completely ignore me because that's just how my dog is. But in a command message, I send a request and expect some kind of response. The producer of the message is asking something else to do some work, and you expect an acknowledgement or some data back. If we think about this in a system perspective, an API is a typical kind of thing where you'd use command messages. I make a request to an API, that API responds. So the key of a command message is that you're expecting an acknowledgement or a response of some kind. We've then got data or document messages, and data or document messages are used to transfer data from one application to another. If one application has data that another application needs, how do we transfer that data asynchronously in a serverless event-driven way? A document message passes data and allows any consumers to decide what to do with it, if anything at all. And then the third type of a message, the event messages, we talked about them last week when we talked about event-driven architectures. But an event occurs in an application, and that application notifies people of what is happening. An event's normally triggered by a change in state in the system that's producing the application. And sometimes event messages might not contain any body, any contents. The event message might function more as a notification. Something happens in my system, and I'm just going to shout it to everybody who may or may not be interested in what I have to say. So they're the three primary types of messages. Just to go back over that, we've got commands, and commands are where I'm asking a system to do something and expecting a response. We've got document or data messages where we're passing data between different systems. And then we've got event-based messages where there's a change of state in my system, and I just want to shout out and tell everybody about that change in system. So now that we've talked about the three types of messages, let's talk about the different patterns that we have to facilitate the passing of these messages. And if we think back to a more typical or traditional architecture, we may have some kind of synchronous communication, and synchronous communication is the simplest form of communication in systems. I have one system here that makes a request to another system. The system producing waits for a period of time, and a response comes back. It's simple, it's low latency, and it fails fast. But this synchronous type of communication, where the requesting service waits or blocks for a response, can cause some challenges. I've just seen a question in the chat that how is a command different from an event? So a command is something where you would expect a response or expect an acknowledgement of some kind. Whereas an event is I just produce an event, and if anyone's interested, they will listen to that. But there's no expectation of a response. So with this synchronous communication pattern, what happens if the consumer is offline? What happens if the API I'm trying to talk to is offline? How does my system then deal with that? Does it retry? Does it try again? But then how many times does it retry? And then does the system block or wait while it's doing them retries? Now, there's patterns that can help you solve these kinds of challenges. But what initially was something simple, I make a request from here and there's a response, starts to get a bit more complicated when you're dealing with retries and failure modes and things like that. This might even cause a problem if you've got lots and lots of requesters requesting your API. So let's say you expose an API, you're a system, and suddenly you receive a lot of load that you don't expect. Now, serverless can help manage this, of course, because if you're using something like Lambda, Lambda will just scale up and scale up and scale up. But as a default, you can only have 1,000 concurrent Lambda executions at any one time in your account. So if you receive a huge influx of load that you might not expect, even Lambda as a default will start to throttle, and you'll start to see errors. If you start seeing these errors, then the caller might have its own retry logic, and that might try again and again, increasing the load on your system. So this synchronous way of communication might be simple, but you can quickly get into some challenging situations when you start doing large-scale distributed systems. That can make your receiver do something like this. You just receive all of this load, and your system just doesn't know what to do with it. And then you start to see issues. You start to see challenges because things just get overloaded. So how do we solve this problem? So our applications need to talk to each other. The parts of our system need to communicate in some way. And there is absolutely a place for synchronous communication in distributed applications, just serverless or microservices. This synchronous communication is good, but where possible, if we can start to use some different patterns, if we start thinking more asynchronously, that can help alleviate some of these problems. So let's get into some different patterns that we can use to try and do this. Primarily, there's two types of communication patterns in the asynchronous world. There's point-to-point communication, or queue-based communication, and then there's publish, subscribe. And we'll get into both of them in just a second, but let's start with queues. So a queue will store a message and its contents until the point in which it's being processed. So if you put a message onto a queue, the message will sit there and wait until the point at which something processes it. A receiver picks it up and processes it. This scales really well because if we think back to that failure mode where we get lots and lots of load, if we have a queue in there, that load will just go and sit on the queue. And then our receiver, our consumer, can just pick messages off the queue, and it can balance that load out in a quite a nice way. So if in this example here, let's say we received a sudden influx of message type A, we could just add more consumers, maybe more Lambda functions. And then when we're done, they all just scale back down and go away. So it helps you balance that load. A use case where this can be quite useful is if you've got a database in your system. Let's say you have a really spiky, really crazy load on your system, and your database starts to become the bottleneck because it can't deal with this spiky workload. You could put a queue between your application and your database. So instead of your application talking directly to your database, your application talks to a queue, and then there's something else pulling the messages off the queue and balancing that load against your database. Every message on the queue will be consumed by only one receiver. So it allows you to give some kind of guarantees in your system that each message will be processed once. I can see a couple of questions. So how about if the system has to communicate back? I will get onto that in just a moment. And who is responsible for deleting the messages? So normally that's the responsibility of the receiver. If you're using something like Lambda, the Lambda service will handle all of that for you. So you wire your Lambda function up to a queue, and then the Lambda service itself will manage taking the message from the queue and then deleting that message after it's processed it. But that is the job of the consumer or the receiver. So when we talk about queues in AWS, we have the simple queue service, or Amazon SQS. So SQS, and there's a bit of contention in this, but SQS is the oldest AWS service, and it was released just slightly before S3. That was back in 2004. So SQS has been around for 18 years now. It's quite funny, actually, just as a slight aside, but serverless and the idea of serverless applications is quite a new thing. But actually, the first two original AWS services were both serverless services, SQS and S3. So SQS offers two different types of queues. SQS has standard queues and first in, first out, or FIFO queues. And there's some differences between the two. So standard queues offer incredibly high throughput, nearly unlimited per second transactions. But the trade-off being it gives you best effort ordering, which means things aren't guaranteed to come off the queue in the same order they went on the queue. And it also gives you at least once delivery. And at least once delivery is really important to understand, because that means that each message might be delivered to a consumer more than once. So you have to handle that in your application. You have to handle the fact that you might receive a message multiple times. First in, first out, or FIFO queues give you almost the complete opposite. So you get a much lower throughput. It's about 300 per second transactions per second. The trade-off being that you get guaranteed ordering and guaranteed one-time delivery. So depending on the needs of your application, that you can either use standard queues or first in, first out queues. A quick question for the chat. So 70.5 million. Does anyone want to take a guess at what this number is from in the context of queues? If you want to just pop a message in the chat. Yeah, requests per second, messages. Yeah, so this both almost correct. So this 70.5 million is the number of messages per second the Amazon retail site was processing on Black Friday and on Prime Day, this year. 70.5 million messages per second. And that blog post there is actually really interesting. So Jeff Barr, an evangelist at AWS, every year he publishes a blog post on the throughput and the numbers from Prime Day. So it's well worth actually going to have a look at that just to see the scale of some of these AWS services. But 70.5 million messages per second. Wow. Okay, so that's queuing. So queuing gives you put something onto a queue and it will sit there until a point in which it's picked up and processed. The other type of messaging channel is publish subscribe, or topic based. And this is slightly different to queuing. So with publish subscribe based patterns, every message is delivered to every single subscriber. So there's no buffering in some respect. You don't get that balancing that a queue gives you. The messages just go into the publish subscribe provider and then just sent out to all of the interested subscribers. And this can make scaling your consumers quite tricky, because every message that gets published just gets sent straight through to your consumers. So there's not really any buffering. What it does give you, though, it gives you a single point where you can just publish all your messages as a producer, and then you can send them out to the different subscribers. And when it comes to publish subscribe on AWS, there's two services you can use that give this publish subscribe type mechanism. The first being Amazon Eventbridge. And we talked briefly about Eventbridge last week, but Eventbridge is an event bus or an event router. So you can publish messages onto Eventbridge, and then you can define rules and targets to then route the messages to your consumers. And with Eventbridge, you can filter your messages with the rules based on any part of the event. So you could look at the contents of the message and maybe filter it based on, maybe you only want messages that have an order value more than £100, for example. You could do that with Eventbridge. The second AWS service that gives you this publish subscribe type functionality is the simple notification service, or Amazon SNS. So SNS is topic based. So you define a topic and then you publish messages to a specific topic. So it's slightly different to Eventbridge, because Eventbridge, you just publish all your messages to one place. It doesn't matter what kind of event it is. Is it a command? You just publish everything to one place. Whereas with SNS, you would ordinarily have a separate topic per type of command, if you will. So you've got separate endpoints for each of your different topics. One of the benefits of SNS is that SNS supports app-to-person notifications. So what that means is you can send emails or SMS messages or mobile push notifications from SNS. It's quite a cool feature, actually. And like SQS, SNS also supports standard and first in, first out topics. And you get the trade-off between the two is similar to SQS. So with standard SNS topics, you get really high throughput, but potentially multiple delivery. Whereas with first in, first out topics, you get that guaranteed ordering, but the throughput is a lot lower. All of these services, all of these services I've talked about so far are completely serverless. So these services manage failures. They scale as you send more things through them. So these are completely serverless services. You don't need to worry about SNS, the internals of SNS going offline. You can just publish messages and SNS handles the rest. And these two patterns don't exist separately. They work really well together. So the first pattern I want to talk about is the fan out pattern. So the fan out pattern allows a message from a single source to be spread out to multiple different consumers. So in this example here, I'm publishing messages to SNS, and then I've got 3 separate subscribers on my SNS topic. Now, with subscriptions in SNS, you can do some element of filtering. So you can filter on attributes of your message, but you can't filter on the contents of your message like you can in Eventbridge. So what I'm doing here is my producer's sending messages to SNS, and then I've got one subscription that's taking messages with the attribute A, and it's sending them to a queue. So they will get in and they will go off to the queue. I've got a second subscription that's filtering to only get messages for B and C, and that's sending them straight to a receiver. It might be Lambda, because Lambda integrates with SNS. And then finally, I've got a third subscription, which is sending emails directly to a person. These might be notifications of things that are happening. And that subscription isn't doing any filtering at all. That's just saying everything that comes through, just send that email to the person. I wouldn't advise doing that in production, because you may end up spamming your users with lots of emails, but that's the kind of thing you can start to do in SNS when you start to chain these services together to build quite complicated patterns to fan things out. I can show you what I mean by attributes when I get into the console. We can have a look at that. In this architecture here, you could quite simply replace SNS with Eventbridge, because Eventbridge provides that same publish and then subscribe and fan out pattern. So you couldn't do the notifications to a human, but you could do the integration with SQS and with Lambda using Eventbridge instead of SNS. The reasons why you would do one and not the other depend entirely on your use case. Eventbridge supports has a limitation on the number of different targets you can have. So with a rule in Eventbridge, you can only target up to 5 different things, and you can specify up to 300 rules on an Eventbridge. So got quite a lot of space there to be able to do lots of interesting things. SNS, on the other hand, supports 12.5 million subscriptions in standard. So you've got a lot bigger range of subscriptions. And if you're doing first in, first out with SNS, that supports about 100 subscriptions on a given topic. So that can be one reason to use SNS over Eventbridge. And the other is around coupling, because with Eventbridge, I'm just publishing messages to one location, regardless of what it is. I just publish the message. Whereas SNS, I would have a separate SNS topic ordinarily based on the different type of message. So then you need to manage them different endpoints. You've got multiple endpoints that your application needs to know about. So there are trade-offs to both. Both provide very similar functionality. So with putting things like queues and topics and using fan out, that starts to solve some of them synchronous failure modes that we talked about. Things like load balancing. If we put a queue in the middle of two services, that then starts to give us that load balancing and allows us to control the load that's on our system as a consumer. But what about that other failure pattern? What about if a receiver is completely offline, or if a message gets published that maybe that message has a problem? There's something about that specific message that's corrupted, maybe. So let's imagine here we've got a producer producing 3 different messages to Eventbridge, and Eventbridge is configured to route them events to a target, say a Lambda function. Now, what if we had a problem with B? So C and A were absolutely fine, but B had an issue. Maybe it was corrupted. There was something about that message that had an issue. Well, what could we do about that? How could we start to handle that? And that's where the idea of dead letter channels or dead letter queues comes in. And what dead letter queues allow us to do is to route off messages that have a problem of some kind. So Eventbridge tries to send the event to our receiver. For some reason, message type B fails. Maybe it's corrupted, the receiver can't process it. So what we do is we just route that message off to a separate place. So our receiver can keep processing messages on the happy path. Say, oh yeah, message type A, message type C, excellent. Keep processing. And then that allows us to maybe come back later on and start to look at what caused B to go wrong, because B is just going to be sent to a queue and it'll just sit on that queue until somebody goes and looks at it. So it allows you to debug your system without actually interrupting the production flow, because everything that's happy and working well will just continue to be processed, and you can go and look at any failed messages at some point later. You could even wire a service up like CloudWatch to alarm based on the number of messages in your dead letter queue. So that gives you a way to notify if you start to see a build-up of failed messages in your dead letter queue. And because, of course, this is just a queue like any old SQS queue, if at some point you need to reprocess them messages, well, you can do that. You can just pull the messages off your SQS queue and just send them around again. And that can be really powerful if you release a change to your system and that breaks something. All your messages get routed to your dead letter queue. You then push out a fix and you just send the messages round again after pushing out the fix. So dead letter queues are a really powerful way to start to error handle these event-driven systems. And we'll see that when I go into the console in just a second. And then the final pattern is if you need a reply. So obviously somebody mentioned this in the chat, like what happens, what do I do if I need a reply? Because in a synchronous based system, it's really simple. I just make a request to the API and the API responds with what I need. Simple, right? Until that API is offline, and then there becomes a bit more complexity. So we can build request reply based patterns in AWS. And there's a number of different ways you can do this. You can use Eventbridge, you can use SNS, SQS. What I'm going to talk through here and show you in the console is using SNS and SQS in combination. So our sender sends a command message of some kind, and it sends that message and it needs an acknowledgement that that message was received. So our sender might send that message to SNS, and SNS will then route that to a subscriber. our subscriber, and as part of that message it sends to SNS, it would include two pieces of data. The first piece of data would be what we'd call a return address. So when I send that data, I say, right, where do I want the reply to come back to as a consumer? In this example, as part of that message, I would include the queue URL from our SQS queue, so that once my consumer's finished processing, it knows where to send that message back to. And the second piece of information you'd include in that message is a unique identifier of some kind, normally called a correlation ID. And that allows us, when the message comes back, to map that message back to the correct producer, if you will. So our sender sends the message to SNS, our consumer does some work, it sends the acknowledgement back to the reply address, in this case, SQS. And then our original sender is just monitoring that SQS queue, pulling the message off, continuing to do its work. And this becomes really powerful, because as a consumer now, as the service who's being asked to do the work, I can control how I balance the load of the messages coming in. So it shifts that responsibility, rather than the producer just being able to send loads and loads of requests to my API. The producer's just sending a message, and at some point later, it will get a response of some kind. So that request reply pattern is a really powerful one. And like I said at the start, there's still absolutely a place for synchronous-based messaging in serverless applications. The challenges with things like this come around consistency. And if you need to absolutely guarantee at the point you make the request that it's been successfully processed, then you might still need a synchronous call, a synchronous API call. But once you start thinking about things more asynchronously, and you default to some of these patterns, you can start to handle failures a lot better. You can handle parts of your systems going offline. You can handle, an external company doing something that breaks their system, but your system can just continue working as normal. So it allows you to really nicely decouple your applications. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to go through some of this stuff in the AWS console now. So I'm just going to switch my screen share over to a different screen. Switch to that screen there, move me out the way, and find Google Chrome. There we are. So if I just give Prasad, if you could just, there we go, thanks Prasad. So I'm in the AWS console here. I've pre-deployed a couple of things, just so you don't have to sit here and wait for things to deploy, just to demonstrate some of these different patterns. And the first one I want to demonstrate is a publish subscribe based pattern using Eventbridge. So just for simplicity's sake, I'm using step functions for a lot of this. I know we've not covered step functions just yet. I'll cover that in detail next week. So what I'm going to do here to demonstrate this publish subscribe is I've got a step function, a workflow that's just going to publish a message to Eventbridge. So if I go in and edit this workflow now, you can see it's about as simple as you could get with a workflow, that it's just going to publish an event to Amazon Eventbridge. I've then got a second workflow that is going to consume messages from Eventbridge, which is this consumer state machine here. So if I go off to Eventbridge in my console now, and we can have a look at how you actually configure these subscribers. So if I go into my event buses in Eventbridge, so by default, you will always have a default event bus. If you're doing any application-specific events, it's recommended to create a separate event bus to do that, which is why I've got this app integration event bus at the bottom here. If I then go off to my rules section here, and I'm going to create a rule now on this Eventbridge, because if you remember, event bus is all rule-based. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to create a new rule. I've already got one here. And this rule is set up to listen for events that have come from a source of mapping to one producer, and with a event type of incorrect detail type mapping. So I've purposefully set this up incorrectly to demonstrate. So what I'm going to do now is edit my event pattern, and I am going to switch this to pull. So this is where I can now edit my event pattern that I'm going to match to. So when an event comes into Eventbridge, Eventbridge looks at all these rules, it compares these rules to the event that comes in, and then it will route it to a specific target. Once I've configured a rule, I can then select where I want the target of that rule to be. So you see my target here is an AWS service. And if we look here, here are all the different services we can target with Eventbridge. So things like SNS, SQS, Lambda, of course. We can even do things like stop EC2 instances on events. So there's some really quite interesting things you can do with Eventbridge. But I want to target a state machine. I want to target my consumer state machine. And then I want to use an existing role that I've already set up. Ordinarily, I would advise doing this using some kind of infrastructure as code, but obviously you watching me write CloudFormation is probably not very interesting to you. So now that we've set up that pattern, I can update my rule. And if I now go back to step functions and I start my producer, so if I start a new execution of my producer workflow, press start execution, that published successfully. And if I now come back to my list of workflows, you will see that my consumer step function has no data. The joys of the live demo. Just give that a second. Can't tell when this happens. So that's how we can configure publish subscribe in Eventbridge. The second thing I wanted to demonstrate to you is how to do the similar thing with SNS. So if I go into simple notification service now, or SNS, and I can look at a list of all the topics that I have in SNS. I've pre-configured some topics in SNS just to demonstrate this. And if I go into this SNS topic here, I can see all of the different subscribers that I've got on my topic. So you see here, I've got 6 different queues subscribed to my SNS topic. So what SNS will do is at the point a message is received into this topic, it will just distribute that message out to all of these queues. If I go in and edit one of these queues, we can have a look at a few different things. So we've got this filter policy, and this is how we can start to do some element of filtering in our in SNS, but we can only do this on attributes, like I say. So when you send a message to an SNS topic, you can specify the body, the contents of the message, but also any attributes that come along with that message. And attributes are just a key and a key value pair of string and string. So I can then start to match different patterns on these attributes using these filter policies. So that gives me some element of filtering in SNS, but nowhere near as powerful as Eventbridge. We've also got this redrive policy or dead letter queue section at the bottom here. And this is where we can configure a dead letter queue for this specific subscription. So I can say if for whatever reason this subscription fails, maybe SNS fails to deliver the message to SQS for whatever reason, I can then redirect this. So I can then redirect this off to a queue. And as soon as I save this now, that will enable this dead letter queue. So if any messages hit this topic and they can't be delivered for whatever reason, we can then route them off to a separate queue. And we can do that both for SNS and for Eventbridge. So Eventbridge targets, we can also configure dead letter queues. We can also configure dead letter queues in Lambda. So if I go off to the Lambda console now and start to look at one of these Lambda functions, I can also configure if I can remember where it is in this console, configuration. I can't remember where the option is. There we are. So on failures, we can configure a destination in Lambda to say if there's a failure in Lambda, again, route that off to SQSQ, or maybe publish that to Eventbridge. So this is where we can start to configure how failures are managed in our system, both if a message fails to get delivered for whatever reason, maybe SQS is offline, the service is offline, then that will get routed to the dead letter queue. Or if our Lambda function just errors completely, if the message that Lambda receives is corrupt in some way, we can then handle that. We can work with that, and we can just route that off for reprocessing later. And then finally, we have the request reply pattern. And again, I'm just doing this with step functions. So I have a step function here that is going to produce a message to Eventbridge. And it's going to use a pattern in step functions called the wait for callback pattern. And I'm going to cover this in more detail next week when I do a whole session on step functions. But what wait for callback allows you to do is to publish a message or do something and then wait. The step function will just pause and it will wait until it's told to continue using an API call. And you can see in the message here that I'm publishing to Eventbridge, I'm saying I'm including both this correlation ID that I talked about, a unique identifier unique to this workflow, and also a return address, so I can tell my consumer where to send its response or its acknowledgement back to. So then when my consumer receives this message and starts to do some work, it can then send that message back to the queue, and the message will be processed out of the queue, and our workflow will be allowed to continue. So that's how these services kind of tie together in AWS. We've got Eventbridge, SQS, and SNS, with trade-offs of using SNS and Eventbridge for publish subscribe. And as I said, this is a really powerful way to start to think about serverless applications and how different parts of your application communicate with each other. If you start to default to thinking asynchronously, and you write code or design architectures that can deal with that slight delay, if you will, in a sense that something will happen at some point in the future, it really helps to increase the resiliency and the way that your applications start to handle failure. Because as Werner Vogels, the CTO of Amazon, says quite famously, everything is failing all the time. Users will do something that you don't expect, or you'll receive some data that you didn't expect to receive, and that will cause a failure. Maybe the Lambda service is offline or SQS is offline. And if you build your services in a way that expect this failure, who are built to handle this failure as a default, it really helps to increase the resiliency of your system. And thinking more asynchronously, using services like SQS as a buffer to balance load, are a really interesting way to start to do that. As always, any questions, any follow-ups, if anything's not made sense and I've missed it in the chat, I've been trying to keep an eye, then feel free to reach out, message me on LinkedIn, message me on Twitter. I would be happy to answer any questions. We are now going to take a short break, and I don't have the same fancy countdown timer that Ashish normally has. So we'll take a 5-minute break now, and we'll come back at about 10 to the hour. for the behavioural section and the interview with our special guest this week. So, yeah, as always, feel free to reach out. I hope you've enjoyed things. Feedback is always welcome, and we'll see you in 5 minutes.
Thank you, James. See you all in 5 minutes. Cool. Uh, Let me give me just one moment. Yeah, time for the special guest today, and I have been having messages like we are covering only serverless technologies. It's just because Ashish was not available today, and that's why we focused on the serverless. From the next week, it will be back to the normal. Like Ashish will be covering the technical session for the first 45 minutes, and it will be a specialist track for serverless 15 minutes, and then 15 minutes for the behavioral. But today it's a bit of a different format. And for today, we will have our special guest, Daniel. Uh, a quick introduction. Daniel starts his cloud journey from a totally non technical background, from dropping out of college to being a taxi driver to bartending. His journey into the cloud technologies and becoming a cloud solutions architect with AWS partners is amazing. Without further ado, let me bring Daniel on screen and I'll let him introduce himself. Daniel.
Hi there, everyone. Thanks for having me. Really great to be on this and be able to share my story and, be able to empower others to start whenever they feel not confident. Yeah, starting with myself, I've started before the pandemic. I knew I wanted to change my job into IT because I come from like engineering background in terms of mechanical engineering, but never liked it. And then I kind of did some odd jobs and done some bartending and taxi driving and stuff, traveling a bit the world. And then I realized that I really want a career. So I got some friends into the IT world, and they was telling me how the cloud space is booming, how AWS is making, like all these changes, and how all this is shaping the future of technology. I said, okay, I want to be part of this, but where do I start, right? So my friends, they were like pushing me towards AWS because it's the leader cloud provider, so I started with a solution architect and pretty much went from there. I
So,
remember I
when did you
started
actually
with,
start for studying for this, Daniel?
yeah, I was just about to say that I remember starting from like Googling what's an IP, and within 4 or 5 months of hard work studying and every day, like studying labs and all this kind of stuff, I managed to get my solution architect associate certification. And yeah.
Wow. So like within 4 months, you are able to like
Yes,
start from scratch and get solution architect associate certification. So
that's correct. Yes.
what resources did you use?
I remember I started with A Cloud Guru because I had a friend who had an account, and he told me like it's really amazing. You should check it out. I said, you know what, I'm gonna buy like a month just to see how it goes. And I went to that, and it was really great. And I felt like it provides me enough information. I didn't really had like to check other ones because when I checked it, it felt exactly what I needed. And yeah, that's the only source I did. And Google, obviously, like everything around. Whenever I there was a term I didn't understood, whenever there's something that I didn't know, I just Google it. And I think I use YouTube too. There were quite a lot of people on YouTube sharing their stories about AWS and stuff. So yeah, but mainly was A Cloud Guru for their videos and the labs. I actually done like really a lot of labs there. So yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Like hands-on experience. A lot of like folks who get certification. The common theme that we hear is that like how to get the hands-on experience to actually convert that knowledge into something that they can put on their resume so that they can get a job. So how did you transition from like just having a certification to getting hands-on experience to getting a job?
I think for me, I realized that while I was studying, I was doing like this hands-on labs, and I was trying to understand how can I make a bit more of that. And I was like YouTubing, and then I saw people on their like YouTube how to do like different stuff. So I remember even a fun story was on a Sunday morning. and it was like 8 a.m. and I was doing like labs, and I was sending SMS to my phone via the, like the AWS services and stuff. It was amazing because once you see, because when you're learning, you see the theoretical part, but when you actually put into practice and you see what you can do with it, it actually gives the real value of what you're learning. You actually feel like it's useful. I can put this in real world example, and then like you feel like all the learning that you've done has some value to it. So I think that's what people should aim to.
Awesome. And like, did you use AWS free tier or any other specific?
Yeah, mostly I use AWS free tier, and obviously, like I think A Cloud Group provides some cloud playgrounds and
Environment,
stuff.
yeah.
But mostly I use my AWS because I felt responsible over it. It's like, when you have your own account and you do all those things at the beginning, like set up a budget and try to understand the services, make sure that you don't go over the limit. Because obviously, like, I started on my own, financing my own stuff. Like, at that time I quit my job, so I needed to make sure that I don't, I didn't have like an extensive budget to go over all this. But I knew that this investment into my future is really worth it. So yeah.
Cool. So let's talk about how did you start applying for jobs when you had this certification, and what was the goal that you set, and how it turned into actually start working in the cloud industry or grabbing your first cloud role.
I think one of the things that people need to do when they start thinking about this is to set themselves a goal, right? Like, where do I want to be? And I remember at that time I said to myself, I want to be a solution architect. To be honest, I didn't fully understand the role of solution architect. Like, I had some idea, but like, you cannot know until you actually go and work as solution architect, right? So, but I put my goal into my mind. I want to be that, and this is what I want to do, right? Then what I did, I think I kind of like reverse engineered the role, right? Like, I looked on LinkedIn on people that they had, that were already solution architect, and on jobs, right? And I kind of looked what kind of skills they need, what kind of knowledge they want me to have. And then I kind of dig into those type of knowledge. And again, like, the people that are already holding it, some of them I reach out and I said, okay, what would you recommend me to do? Or, like, how should I do this and stuff? So this is how I was kind of building towards getting that first job, right? And so firstly, I had the solution architect. Then I studied also for the sysops because while I was doing this solution architect, I realized networking is quite important, Linux is quite important, because most of the time AWS builds on top of everything. So it's not like just enough to know just AWS, because you need to understand how everything connects, right? So I've kind of done some studies into that area, and then I realized that that also fits with the sysops. So I passed that certification too, and then I realized that, okay, this is the time where I need to search for a job. And I have to say, like, I must have applied over 300 jobs. I might have texted so many people, but the key of it is the perseverance, like the persistence of doing it, right? Because you have to understand that when you try to do something you've never done, firstly, you're not going to be sure that you know what you're doing, but then also, like, you have to show to be persistent. You have to show the desire to learn, to work hard, to be able to sustain all this of a new role in IT, coming from a non-technical background. So for me, I was honest to myself, and I was asking myself, like, if I get tomorrow a role, will I be able to say, okay, I know what I'm doing and stuff? So I think that's what prepared me to that, because I kind of felt like I was missing a lot of it, but I also know a lot of AWS. So because I was not coming from a background in like, let's say, on-premise technologies and stuff like that, I focused a lot on AWS because I felt like that's where my strength will be, right? So by knowing AWS a lot, I felt like I can be, like, better and more valuable to a potential employer than to come up from like a background where they know on-premise but they don't really know AWS. So yeah.
You mentioned that you applied to 300 jobs,
Yes.
right, to get your first job role. I'm sure that there will be moments when you would have thought it is really too hard. How did you keep going in those moments?
And to be honest, like, out of the 300 jobs, like, if I put it as a percentage, probably 70% didn't reply back. 15% maybe replied something but not enough. And then I remember I only had like a few potential talks and actually one interview. So that interview ended up being my job, right? So like I knew that I have lots of things that I'm not covering from a technology point of view, but I focused a lot on my personality. So every time I would talk to a potential recruiter, I said, I know I have gaps, but I'm very hardworking. I'm dedicated. I'm willing to put 15 hours of work just to make it true and just to, like learn and all that. So I think when you come from that kind of background, I think that your personality and your dedication counts a lot more compared to the skills that you have in terms of technological.
Yeah. So on that, there's a question by the audience. What experience did you show it to your current employer?
To be honest, like when I actually put on my CV, I put I put my work experience as it is, but then in the description, in the things I put, like I have some AWS labs experience and putting some technical try at home type of things, where I build my own stuff in AWS, build like a normal 3-tier architecture with a VPC and stuff like that. So I didn't really have work experience, but I showed them that I was doing some stuff in my own private time and, taken from blogs or taken from common patterns infrastructure and tried to build them myself. So this is what I showed them. And I think that counted in terms of not necessarily work experience, but in terms of passion and desire to make it work.
Cool. So, yeah, like talked about, applying to these jobs. So, is there any specific strategy used to apply to these jobs? Like, how did you find these roles?
I remember like I should have prepared more. I didn't really apply the specific strategy. For me, I kind of just went out and applied to all the jobs that had like entry level and all this kind of stuff, because I know that it might be better to be targeted, but for me it was very hard to know what I'm targeting, right? So I kind of went out and applied to all kind of stuff. And to be honest, like the job that I first got, it actually came to a recommendation from somebody that showed my passion. And I got a message from the CEO saying like, you want to join us because we really like what you what you're representing, your passion, your hard work, your dedication. You want to come for an interview, and that's what it was. So I feel like it was more through the networking that led me there. It was not necessarily to the applying and stuff, but it was more about the networking and the persistence of it. So yeah.
We'll come to that in a second. That's very interesting that a CEO contacted you directly. There is a question from the audience. Did you take cloud practitioner exam before Solutions Architect Associate?
Unfortunately, no. I've actually considered that after I actually took my cloud practitioner, like, I don't know, after I had 4 of them, just because I wanted to have that one too. But I didn't, because I didn't know at that time, like some friends recommend you to go straight to the solution architect. Cloud practitioner was so easy, but I didn't know better. But now knowing better, I would definitely recommend go to cloud practitioner first and then move to solution architect, because I feel like in those 4 months, he actually englobated the cloud practitioner too, but he would have given me a bit more confidence to it, and he would have build me up a bit more, because if you pass first the cloud practitioner, it gives you some boost confidence to go to the solution architect and stuff. And yeah, like for me, actually, the first exam for the solution architect, I failed it, right? Which it was terrifying because I never felt like failing and stuff. But I think it was a very, very good lesson. And I feel like that's why I feel people should take it step by step and not try to jump very far, right? So that was a lesson that I've learned pretty good. But yeah.
No, I agree. Cloud practitioner acts as a good milestone in between.
Yes.
Like if you're starting specifically as a new in the cloud, then it acts as a good milestone and boosts your confidence, as you said. Now, there are more questions in the chat, and I'll pop them up. But let's go back to your first role. You said that through some networking, a CEO contacted you directly. Throw more light about that. Like, how did that network develop over the time? And what did the CEO saw that a CEO contacted you directly?
So for me, like I realized from the beginning that without a solid network, it's like you don't really get the chance, because I feel like through networking people help each other. And what I saw in the IT community when I started my LinkedIn, and I kind of saw as a social network in which you connect with people, like-minded people. And I said, if I want to be into this space, I want to be connected to these people. I want to see what they think, what they do, how they do stuff. And I actually went there and I started adding lots of people into the AWS and trying to follow their posts, learn from it and stuff like that. And then again, like I also added potential recruiters and try to understand like what they're looking for and so on. So I kind of end up building a network of like 2,000, 3,000 people, which was really great. I really felt like it was good. And it was not necessarily just for the sake of it. It was actually like learning from people posts. Even nowadays, like I see people posting interesting stuff, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is very interesting. I'm gonna read this and so on. So, I also try to get myself to that. And I wanted to make the point that this network doesn't actually get you the job. It actually gets you through the door, right? So like you actually make it through the interview point, because you showcase on your network that you're working hard, you have the passion, and some people might spot you and they'll recommend you for things, and that will get you through the interview stage. And that's where you have to do the work. And yeah.
Yeah. So like you said that like you increase your LinkedIn network from like almost like starting round up to around 2,000, 3,000. So what was the time frame like that you were able to increase this network?
I think it was more like 6 to 8 months, something like that.
So
And
like
in
parallel
this
to
month,
studying for the certifications, you started building your network also.
yes, at the same time, yes, yes, because I felt like valuable. And I learned one thing, for example, like there were people like that come up with hacks onto how to build this network and stuff quickly. But I didn't want it to build it quickly. I wanted to build it meaningfully. So that means like when you comment to somebody, don't just put a generic comment. Just ask a question, like show that you care, like try to understand, like ask for advice or something like that. Don't just post a generic thing. So I feel like and if people sustain each other, like into helping each other, motivating each other, that creates a great community. And like I get people asking me like what should I do and stuff, and I try to answer them from my point of view and so on. So I feel like this helps not just current people that are trying to get, future people that are trying to get in the industry, or people that already exist in the industry. So I feel like this is something that the community really helped a lot.
That's awesome. So for everyone, I've just posted Daniel's LinkedIn profile. Feel free to follow his journey. But yeah, now coming to the point, like a CEO contacted you. So how did that interview happen? Like were you nervous? Like was it the first
Yes,
interview you were giving for this cloud
yes,
role, or did you give any other
yes.
interviews?
Yeah, it was the first interview. I remember I got there. It was with a senior engineer. Like he definitely knew a lot of things. He asked me a lot about Linux, Python, AWS, and stuff. And like I think I tried my best, and I actually was honest to him. And I said sometimes when I didn't know what's happening, I said, "Look, I don't know the answer to this question or something. I'm gonna research it. I'm gonna look it up, and stuff." So, and I remember at one point he was asking me like, "If I don't give you this job, what would you do?" And I said to myself, "I will do the same I do now. I'll go home, study harder, and I know one day somebody will give me this opportunity. But I just want to make myself sure that I'm ready for the opportunity. I wouldn't want to be somewhere where I know I cannot do the job and I'm struggling and stuff. So I definitely like will go home and work harder and make myself better, and somebody will give me this opportunity, and I'll prove to them that it was worth giving the opportunity." So at that point, I think like it was like give me a few minutes, and he left to the room, and then when he come back, he was like, you know, you might not fit like 100%, but your dedication and your personality and the things you talk about is really good for us. It matches the role and stuff, so we want to offer you this role. So yeah.
That's good. So seems like all this while that like okay, tell me this. From the point you started till the point you interviewed, what was the time lag? How much time it took for you to like thinking about okay, let's start with studying about cloud versus landing the role?
I think it was 6 months. 6 months and a bit.
Okay,
Yeah.
6 months. So that's pretty
But
good.
like the fourth
And
the four first 4 to 5 months I studied, and the last month I was looking for a job. But in the same time, I was studying too, as in like, you should never study. Like even now, I've been having jobs for like 2 years, and I'm still studying every day. Still trying to better myself. I'm still trying to, like learn more about it. I mean, there's never a place to stop. Like this is an industry where if you stop, the information will just get ahead of you, and you're not going to be able to do a good job. And I think that's what everybody wants to do, right? To do a good job. So yeah.
So cool. So when you joined your first job, yeah, just talking about like studying. So when you first joined this job, like, did you feel that like you were out of place, or how are you going to perform, or what did like? Was there any imposter syndrome uh, there, or how did you like keep learning?
Yeah, I think the imposter syndrome, to be honest, like happens every day with everyone. I think on every level. I think if you actually feel that you know everything, I think it's very hard to get that feeling, right? Especially in technology world where all the technologies are new, and every time like you deal with new things, and stuff. Unless you get yourself outside of a comfort zone, and like you're refusing to deal with new technologies and stuff. Sure, you might be able to not get that imposter syndrome. You might know what you're doing, but most of the time, I don't think that's happening, right? So for me, definitely, I felt a lot, and I'm still am. I think at certain degrees, I'm still am feeling that. However, I try to understand that it's okay not to know everything. That's why I think people work in teams. That's why we need to rely on each other in terms of like, I know some stuff, you know some stuff. And I think it's hard to judge on people, especially like, you know, I I had points where I knew certain things that a senior didn't, but that doesn't mean that I was better than him or he was better than me, right? It's just like, it is what it is. He learned some stuff and he know better because he dealt with those technologies. I learned some other stuff, and I was trying to help him, and I was trying, like, it's not about proving who knows more. It's about trying to help each other to build something great, because that's how you build something great, through the team and through knowledge sharing and through helping each other. So I feel like that's the thing we should have in mind. And when you experience something you don't know, no problem. Just go look, research, do some stuff, but don't feel fearful about it. Like it's okay not to know everything.
Cool. And I see that you have done a lot of other certifications, like Azure Fundamentals and CompTIA, and recently I think HashiCorp. So how is this journey going on of certifications?
So for me, obviously, like I want to specialize myself in AWS. I really want to know everything about AWS, everything about the cloud. But I remember at one point, the tendency of multi-cloud, right? Like everybody was like, wow, this is amazing. And I agree. It's definitely amazing to kind of understand the benefit of all the cloud providers and trying to integrate it well and stuff like that. But at that point, when I went to Azure and I started learning Azure, I was really confused. Even though the technologies were the same, the service names were different and so on. So I was really like to the point where I was thinking, like, what am I doing? Like, I don't think this is a good thing, because if I didn't know well enough AWS, why am I going to another cloud and stuff? So I said, okay, I'm gonna stop this. So I'm focusing right on AWS, and then maybe I'll go multi-cloud whenever it's time, right? So at that point, I was a bit okay. Maybe I should adapt to Azure too, but then I understood that it's a bit too early in the process to try to grasp multi-cloud and stuff like that. So I rather concentrate on one thing and know one thing better, and then maybe have knowledge and stuff. In terms of the other ones, CompTIA, right? Like I went for the Network Plus, because in my first role I learned a lot of networking, and that helped me getting the knowledge. And as I said, networking is very important because everything builds on networking. And at that point, I was like, if I have the knowledge, why not get the certificate? It's not necessarily that it helps you a lot, because as I said, certificate doesn't necessarily like land you a job. It gets you through the door, but does not land you a job. So I felt like, okay, I got the knowledge. Why not try the exam and get it? So I've done some studies and I passed it. Then the same with the security. With the security is a bit different, because when I started AWS, I also wanted to do security because I'm passionate about security. I think security is very, very important, especially nowadays. And I try to do security in my own free time. I do a lot of like try hack me, hack the box, and range force and stuff. And I felt like learning about security. So that one, it was just for me. And I would just be like, okay, I should just get this just to prove myself that I have knowledge of security and stuff like that. So yeah, and then I have another one, Cloud Plus from CompTIA. I think this was offered by CompTIA as a free voucher, and I said, I'm dealing with cloud technologies, I'm dealing with cloud, stuff. Why not? So it was, as I said, it was not necessarily for me to take it, but I was offered a free voucher by CompTIA. Somebody approached me, said, "Oh wow, your story is great, you're doing great. Do you want this voucher and stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So yeah, and I went for it. So yeah.
That's awesome. There are a lot of questions. Let me start popping a few.
Yes.
One is, during interview, what projects you mentioned as a freshman?
I think at that point I didn't really understand the concept of project. I mentioned a lot of free labs, like hands-on labs, where I said, I was doing this, doing that, but not necessarily tied up as a project. I feel like now I would definitely like see there are quite a few projects out there that you can document and you can, kind of like put it in your CV in order to showcase it to your potential employee. I think at that point I didn't really knew about this, but now having this knowledge, I think I would have done that much better. So I feel like project work is something that you can show to your potential employee, even though you don't have work experience, but it's definitely something to show that you have done something practical. So yeah.
Another question. Do you intend to take additional certifications?
Yeah,
Like,
so actually, I do have the all three AWS associate ones. Then I went for the specialty for the security one because, as I said, I was passionate about security in AWS. Recently, in my job in the last 2-3 months, I was dealing with databases, and that made me learn also for the database specialty one, which I also got it. In terms of Solution Architect Pro and DevOps Pro and stuff, I definitely want to have all of them at one point. But in terms of those, even though I have people telling me that based on my knowledge and based on my experience, I can definitely pass them, I feel like it's not yet the time. I feel like I would still leave it maybe another half a year, because like I got my AWS certificate 2 years ago and I'll just take it right before it expires. Not necessarily because I feel like I cannot do it now. I just feel like now is not a really important milestone for me. Now it's important for me to gather more practical experience, to try to understand more about it, and not necessarily just pass the exam, right? So like, I feel like this is where I got already some of the certifications I won, and I just want now to get more experience and stuff. You were mentioning also the HashiCorp one. Again, based on my work, I was dealing a lot with Terraform as a infrastructure as a code, and specifically Terraform. And the same, like I was dealing with it and I was learning from scratch how to do it. And I said, you know what, if I'm learning all this knowledge and stuff, why not go for the certification too, just to prove to myself that I can do it. I have the certifications. But then again, don't take the certification as a practical thing, because certification shows that you have the knowledge to do stuff, but not necessarily shows that you have the practical. The practical you demonstrate to the project and stuff. So yeah.
so you talked about having this practical experience, and right now you are focusing more on getting that practical experience, and that leads us to actually like the next question. Are you enjoying your work? Is it what you expected?
Uh, it's very hard question because I joined this AWS partner company and it's an AWS consultancy. It's an A to Z, like we deal with lots of AWS services. I jump from project to project to, inquiries to just answering questions to customer, educate them on certain AWS services and stuff. I definitely enjoy it. I definitely think it's a great way to learn. It's like accelerated my career to the point where I end up into a very short amount of time to learn so much about AWS. But I also feel it's very stressful. It's very hard to keep on, with work, with study, try to dedicate the weekend for it and so on. I definitely feel the pressure of it, but it's something like I really enjoy. Some people don't really enjoy, but I really take it as a constructive step, and I feel like now is the time for me to work hard and prove myself and get that practical knowledge. Because when you work at a consultancy, you get so many different projects that you dig in, and so many things that you are like learning from, so many different customer infrastructure. So I want to take all that in order to absorb as much as I can and try to do the best I can.
Awesome. So now, interesting question. Did you learn programming?
So I remember at the beginning I didn't. I did learn some Python because I know Python is used for automating and infrastructure and stuff. So I still want to learn Python. I'm still learning Python. I'm still at the point where I feel like every time you learn about it, I feel it's very good, but I tend to fall into the category of the infrastructure type of person. So more about infrastructure and security. I want to learn because I want to know more and I want to understand better these things, but it's definitely hard to try to go into all the sectors. So you have to understand that when you go to IT, there's many sectors, and you have to have a clear direction, right? If you go, you either go deep in one sector and you learn just that, or you just tend to become a generalist where you know a little bit of everything and you kind of have the knowledge how to dig into everything and try to understand how to integrate. So I'm at that point where I do learn programming. I remember at the beginning I learned some HTML, CSS, and like Python and stuff just for my knowledge, just because I thought it would be good. But I don't think necessarily it's mandatory to deal with the cloud. I feel like it's good to get acquainted with CLI and have some knowledge of programming a little bit and try to understand it, but I don't think it's mandatory, no.
Okay, that brings us to next question. How much hands-on do you do as solutions architect?
I think varies because I tend to split my work, I would say 50-50 into implementing, doing stuff, and then 50% into pre-sale meeting, preparing solutions and preparing a proposal for customers and stuff. Maybe like cost evaluation and stuff. So I feel like it's more about 50-50 in my role, where like I tend to do some hands-on, but I also tend to go customer facing and stuff. So yeah.
So what I would like to tell the audience is that being hands-on doesn't mean that we are programming. Hands-on
Yes.
is lots more than like just programming. It's like
Correct.
working with AWS console. Even if
Correct.
you're doing like say well architected review, in which you're not doing any programming, you're just looking into the architectures, and that's also hands-on with a pre obviously consulting involved in, because if you're doing a well architected review, you're providing recommendations of the best practices, but you're not programming. So if
That's
you are confusing it like being hands-on means being programming, it's not the case. Without even knowing about the knowledge of programming, you can be hands-on. As Daniel mentioned, having programming is a good thing to have, nice thing to have, but it's not mandatory at all.
that's correct. Yes.
Cool. Okay, let me see more questions. Okay, there is another question. What do you think about networking specialty? Is it necessary on the market?
That's actually the current certification I'm studying for. Is definitely a quite hard one. I find it very challenging. I don't think necessarily it's something that you must have, because I feel like in order to put in practice the knowledge that you get there, I think there are not a lot of companies. I mean, we're talking more about enterprise, right? So the enterprise companies will have all this kind of like things that needed for networking specialty. In my field, I deal a lot with startups or a lot with companies that are very agile, and they build a lot on serverless and stuff like that. So they do not necessarily have on premise, or they do not build a lot on the networking side. So I want it. I feel like I can get it because, as I said, like I also have networking knowledge and stuff. But I don't feel it's necessary. It will make you look good, but it doesn't necessarily you know mean that you can like use it on your day-to-day job or something like that. So yeah.
Cool. The next question we have is, which additional tools you went through before attending interviews?
For me, I think it's at that point and stuff, like I tried to learn a lot about Linux. I feel like for me that was something very strong and I was passionate about. A lot about Docker, because I feel Docker is a lot about packaging everything in such a smooth way where you can deploy on every platform and stuff like that. Ansible for like configuration and stuff. I feel like there's a range of tools, but you should not necessarily concentrate yourself on getting to know the tools. Just try to understand the basic of it, try to understand how they work and what they're used for and stuff. Because in your day-to-day job, I feel like you're going to work with lots of tools. You're not going to be able to, like be expert in all of them. You're not going to be able to, understand all of them to a deep level. I feel like it's important to understand what they do, what you're using for, like to have some basics on it, but not necessarily to know it to a deep level, unless you plan to go towards that and actually, work specifically just with those tools. So yeah.
So in total, how much experience do you have right now overall?
Right now, I would say, so I started like, I have like 2 years and a half in terms of since I started, and I have like 2 years experience. So, and it's crazy because I know it doesn't sound a lot, and I face the rejection in interviews where people telling me like, like, but you don't have enough experience and stuff. And I actually ask them this question, but think about a normal engineer that will go to work and they will just put their 9 to 5 and go home and don't do no studies and stuff like that. That engineer with 5-10 years will be considered, but somebody with 2 years experience, which worked like pretty much every day, learned a lot, build a lot, like try to, like in your free time, try to do stuff, practical stuff to showcase and stuff, like you wouldn't consider it for the job, right? So I feel like there are definitely some things on the market that they're not, like some of the recruiters, they are definitely, like gatekeepers and stuff, where they don't let you pass if you don't have those minimum years of experience. But I feel like some people with good experience, they can potentially see your dedication and your potential, and you can go past that even though you don't have this specific years and stuff. But I have like around 2 years and a half, yeah, like around 2 years of practical work, yeah.
So how do you get past that hurdle of like having these conversations with the recruiters that see, like, though I have just 2 years of experience, but the amount of effort I have put in, I might be having almost 5 years of experience in terms of the hours, in terms of the experience that I have gained. So how do you get past that hurdle of convincing these with recruiters so that you get to the interview stage?
I feel that like through my network, through LinkedIn, I get a lot of offers. Some of them, they're not really good for me because I feel like they're just standard job offers, but some of them, they're really good. And then I would say, yeah, I'm interested about, recruiters reach out and stuff, but then they go through the role, and then they say something like, but you don't really have all the experience and stuff like that. And I said, like, yeah, I understand, because it's very hard for somebody to actually have all the experience that you showcase, because nowadays I feel like the job market demands a lot, right? But at the same time, I focus not necessarily just on the technical. I also focus on my personality, also focus on my hardworking and dedication, because I feel like some people here got a bit wrong, especially when you start. All your focus is to get all those technology in, all those information in, all the things in the CV, but they don't focus on their personality too, right? They don't focus on what they can bring as a human being, and as a, the way you think and the way you do stuff, right? Because yes, at the beginning I didn't really know, and I failed like some interviews and stuff, but then I like the confidence that gives you when you start talking about things. And obviously through my work too, the fact that I dealt with a lot of customers and stuff gave me a lot of confidence that people don't even recognize that I have 2 years experience. Some of them, they're like still baffled, like how is this possible? And I said, it's not necessarily like the time, is the effort that you put in, because I'm sure even me with 2 years, some people with 1 year experience can beat me and know more than me and stuff. So it's just about how much you can put, and how much you can accumulate, and how much you can show too about it, because it's not just about remembering, but it's also about doing stuff.
There is a question for you. Can you remember three accomplishments in your first 3 months?
Yes, so definitely, like my first 3 months, so they were very challenging. I was dealing with lots of stuff, and I remember still my first day when I got access to like a customer account through their console. I was like frightened. I was need to make sure that everything was double check and stuff. But yeah, like some of my few accomplishments, like implementing auto scaling, and like educate some customers on RDS and on EC2, some of the security stuff, So I feel like mostly at the beginning was a lot about consulting and not necessarily hands-on, because at the beginning I was not really like let a lot to do in terms of like myself. It was over like supervising by somebody more senior, and we would do it together and try to understand. But I definitely remember, like, mostly we dealt with EC2, RDS, like some of the most common services. So yeah.
That brings us to the next question, which we'll mark it as last because we are upon time. How does a solutions architect day, or do look like in a day?
Yeah, for me, for example, like, I tend to, as I said, split my time between potential customers that they're trying to look to, like a range of, like, getting knowledge on a range of services. Some questions they ask, like, how do I secure my EC2? Some things that are related to cost optimization. Some people will come and they say, I want to migrate the system to AWS, and we will make a diagram, we'll make a, like a cost estimation, try to make them understand what will be required to migrate to this cloud, or to just start from scratch. Like, we ask lots of questions about what kind of technologies you want to use, or like what's important to you and stuff. And then we go to the preparation of the solution, and then we present it to the customer. And if customer agree, we go and implementing the solution. Depends, either through the console, either like infrastructure as a code, depending on what the customer desire and what they're comfortable with. So most of the stuff, I think it ranges from sales to analyzing to implementing to doing stuff. So I think you should expect that everything, and also lots of research, because like, if you're not researching, you're not doing good. Like, you definitely need to all the time try to understand better, because the more you understand, the better the better solution you can provide for your customers, which makes you a better engineer and providing more value. So yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel, today. Any last advice for like our audience, or anyone who is actually going through this journey of like getting into their first cloud role?
I think that as much as you concentrate on the technology side, make sure you also concentrate on your personality, on your network. I feel like that's very important. Don't try to just remember everything, because this is not about remembering, it's about understanding and about practical side. Like, try to do some practical and showcase. I know it's hard, but if you keep doing that, and you keep persisting, and you keep honest to yourself about, like, can I do this job? Am I good enough and stuff? Try to understand that. And if you put all this and you're dedicated and you're really sure you want to do this, I'm sure you're going to achieve it. It's just a matter of time when that chance will come to you. But when that chance comes to you, you want to make sure you're ready. So I think that this is where you need to focus, about being ready when somebody gives you that chance.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me add James also to the stream. It was great chatting with you, Daniel. Really loved it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. It was an awesome story. Good to hear from you.
So, James, I see there is a common thread between you and Daniel,
Which is,
mechanical engineering.
oh, of course, yeah. I nearly did it. I nearly went to study. Yeah, I nearly went to study mechanical engineering, then chose IT instead. So I didn't get as far as being an engineer, but I almost did.
Same here, because I felt like it's not something that I want to do. And
Yep.
like, I felt IT is something for the future, and also something that you cannot get capped at. Like, I really love this learning and doing more and stuff.
Yeah.
So with IT, you can never say I'm the best at IT. There's no such thing. Like,
Yeah,
there's always something you need to learn and stuff. So I felt like, for me, I take it like, as a game, next level, and try to do better, and try to like gather more all these things. So yeah, I'm a bit of a gamer, sorry, but I take that essentially. So, and I feel like in life is like that. You accumulate skills, you go to the next level, and so on. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you find the same as me, though, because you're so interested in learning things, your to-do list just grows and grows and grows, and there's everything.
100%.
Oh, I want to learn that thing. Oh, that thing.
I cannot express the number of tabs I have and the number
Yeah.
of things I want to do and stuff. It's just not enough time, But I think it's to understand that you have to have a balance, like learning and doing at the same time. I think that's the balance that you want to keep. And also think about what you're passionate about. If you're not doing something that you're not passionate, search for something else, because like, there's so many IT sectors that you can choose from. So it's not necessarily that if you stick a couple of years on one, you cannot switch to another one and be a new beginner on that and build up on that. It will actually make you even better, because you have other background that makes you understand. So yeah.
Awesome. With that, Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope this was useful, and see you all next week.
Yeah, thanks
Thank you
everyone.
very
See you next
much.
week.
Bye, guys.